Every wall has a memory. Every crack holds a sigh. This building was not just a structure of bricks and mortar. It was a living archive of human despair. In a world where law is just words on paper, the true judges hide in the infrastructure, knowing every secret, waiting for the moment when the silence of sleep makes you vulnerable. Everyone is looking for a way out, but the true prison is only a reflection of your own sins.
The old building, a relic of an era when cramped spaces were considered cozy, stood hunched against the sky like a tired giant. Its brick facade, stained with decades of rain and smog, seemed to weep grudgingly. This was the apartment, the one the social workers had so confidently proclaimed would be a wonderful place for your child. It was a place imbued with a sterile kind of hope, a fresh coat of paint trying desperately to mask the lingering scent of despair. For Jonathan, it was meant to be a new beginning, a sanctuary after the storm that had ravaged his life. He'd clung to their words, a desperate man grasping at straws. He'd believed them. He had been so terribly wrong. The first hint that something was amiss wasn't a scream, or a bang, or the chilling scrape of claws against plaster. It was subtler, an almost imperceptible murmur that Jonathan initially dismissed as the building's ancient plumbing groaning under its own weight, or the wind playing tricks through the compromised seals of the windows. He'd attributed it to the ventilation system, a relic of a bygone age that seemed to breathe in unison with the apartment itself. He'd heard the wind whistle through it on blustery nights, a mournful sigh that was almost comforting in its familiarity. But this was different. It wasn't the random sigh of the wind. It was a pattern, a rhythm that began to coalesce, to take on a shape in the periphery of Jonathan's hearing. It was a sound that crept into his waking thoughts and slithered into his dreams, a constant, low hum that was slowly, inexorably, sharpening into focus. At first, it was just unintelligible whispers, like a crowd murmuring just out of earshot. Jonathan would pause in his daily routines, straining to decipher the faint vocalizations. He'd rationalize it, blaming his own frayed nerves, the stress of his new, solitary existence. He'd tell himself it was the echo of his own anxieties, resonating within the hollow chambers of the apartment. But the whispers persisted, growing bolder, more distinct. They were no longer just sounds, they were words, forming coherent sentences, though their meaning remained elusive. Then came the details. The whispers began to weave themselves into the fabric of Jonathan's memories, dredging up fragments of his past that he had meticulously buried, moments he had fought tooth and nail to forget. They spoke of things no one else could possibly know, of secret shames and hidden regrets. The ventilation system, once a benign architectural feature, had become a conduit for something else. Something that knew him. The whispers spoke of his childhood, of the way he used to hide under his bed, terrified of the shadows. They recalled his first awkward kiss, the sweaty palms and stammering words. They even whispered of the petty thefts he'd committed as a teenager, acts of rebellion he'd long since chalked up to youthful indiscretion. These were not general memories. They were specific, granular details, unearthed from the deepest recesses of his consciousness. And then, one evening, as Jonathan sat at the warm kitchen table, the dim light casting long shadows across the room, the whispers coalesced into a single, chilling voice. It was a dry, papery sound, like dead leaves rustling, or the brittle turning of ancient pages. It was undeniably male. And it was speaking directly to him. The voice didn't just recall his past, it named him. It spoke his childhood nickname, a name he hadn't heard in decades, a name he had actively suppressed, associating it with a time of innocence and vulnerability he felt he had long since lost. It used it with a strange, possessive familiarity, as if it had always known him, watched him, waited for him. "Leo," the voice whispered, the sound seeming to emanate from the very walls, from the air vents that crisscrossed the ceiling. "They called you Leo, didn't they, Leo?" Jonathan froze, his heart leaping into his throat. Leo. That was a name from so long ago, a name belonging to a boy he barely recognized anymore. He tried to ignore it, to convince himself it was a hallucination, a stress-induced auditory illusion. He turned up the radio, the tinny pop music a jarring counterpoint to the unnerving whispers. But the voice was persistent, weaving its way through the melodies, a dark thread in a bright tapestry. "You thought you could leave Leo behind, didn't you?" The voice continued, its tone laced with a cruel amusement. "But Leo is still here. Leo remembers everything." The voice's knowledge was terrifyingly precise. It spoke of his insecurities, his fears, the deep-seated anxieties that had plagued him for years. It knew about the nights he'd stared at the ceiling, paralyzed by a nameless dread. It knew about the moments of profound loneliness, the gnawing emptiness that no amount of distraction could fill. Jonathan's initial fear began to curdle into a primal terror. This wasn't just an echo, it was an entity, sentient and malevolent, residing within the very infrastructure of his supposed sanctuary. He started spending his days in a state of heightened anxiety, jumping at every creak, every rustle. He found himself staring at the ventilation grills, his eyes tracing the intricate patterns, trying to pinpoint the source of the insidious whispers. The social workers had spoken of a safe environment, a place for his son, Leo. Now, the very air his son would breathe felt tainted. Then came the offer. It was delivered not with a booming pronouncement, but with the same insidious whisper, a seductive venom that promised a twisted form of salvation. Jonathan was in his son's nursery, a room painted a cheerful yellow that now felt like a mockery, holding his sleeping infant, the tiny creature a beacon of pure innocence. The voice began to speak, its tone shifting, becoming almost conversational, yet laced with an ancient, predatory hunger. "You have something precious, Leo. Something I desire." Jonathan's breath hitched. He clutched his son tighter, the baby stirring slightly in his arms. "This child," the voice continued, a chilling possessiveness in its cadence, "is a vessel. A new beginning. I can help you, Leo. I can make things easier." Jonathan felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. Make things easier how? He thought, though no sound escaped his lips. And that's when the entity laid out its bargain, a horrifying proposition that threatened to shatter the fragile peace Jonathan had fought so hard to achieve. "Give me your child," the voice whispered, the words like a viper's hiss. "Let him be my new vessel. And I will keep your secret. I will ensure that no one ever learns what truly happened to Sarah." The name, Sarah, struck Jonathan like a physical blow. Sarah, his wife. The memory of her, her laughter, her warmth, was a raw wound that had never truly healed. And the circumstances of her departure, those were the very details the entity was now threatening to expose. The whispers had already alluded to it, hinting at the truth he had so carefully constructed a narrative to conceal. Jonathan's mind reeled. The unspoken truth of Sarah's death, a truth he had wrestled with in the darkness of his solitary nights, a truth he had confessed to no living soul, was now being held over him like a guillotine. The social workers had seen a grieving father, a responsible adult seeking a stable home for his son. They hadn't seen the guilt, the suffocating weight of his complicity. The entity's offer was a Faustian bargain of the highest order. His son, his entire future, his only remaining joy, in exchange for the preservation of his dark secret, the expungement of his past sins from the eyes of the law. The thought of his son in the clutches of this unseen horror was unbearable, yet the specter of Sarah's truth, of the police knocking on his door, of his son being taken from him in a different, more public, and perhaps more devastating way, was equally terrifying. He spent the rest of that night in a state of agonizing indecision, pacing the small apartment, the whispers a constant, insidious pressure. He looked at his son, sleeping soundly in his crib, his tiny chest rising and falling with each peaceful breath. He looked at the ventilation grills, the dark openings that seemed to stare back at him with an unseen intelligence. He thought of Sarah, her bright smile, her unwavering love. He thought of the accident, the terrible, irreversible accident. He thought of the choices he had made in the aftermath, the desperate scramble to contain the truth, to protect himself, to protect his son from the fallout of his own actions. The entity's voice, though never loud, seemed to fill the apartment, a relentless presence. I know, Leo. I know about the slippery road. I know about the broken headlight. I know about the call you never made. Each word was a precise insertion of ice into Jonathan's veins. The slippery road, a patch of black ice hidden by the early morning fog. The broken headlight, a detail he had hastily repaired, convinced it was insignificant until the investigators had pressed him. The call he never made, the call to emergency services that he'd hesitated on for a crucial few minutes, paralyzed by fear and a desperate, selfish hope that she might still be. He couldn't finish the thought. The weight of it was crushing. The entity continued its persuasive whispers, "Give him to me, Leo. And Sarah's memory will remain untainted. You will be free. Free to live, free to forget. Free to forget." Was that even possible? Or would the knowledge of his sacrifice, of the price he'd paid, haunt him more than the truth ever could? The next morning, the apartment felt heavier, the silence thicker, pregnant with an unspoken dread. Jonathan had made no decision, yet the entity seemed to have interpreted his paralysis as a form of consent. He was making breakfast for his son, the baby's gurgles and coos a temporary balm on his ragged nerves, when he heard it. A faint, metallic scraping sound. It was coming from the nursery. He froze, his hand hovering over the baby's bottle. The sound was distinct, deliberate. Not the random creak of old wood, or the groan of settling pipes. This was the sound of something being manipulated, of something being carefully worked at. He edged towards the nursery door, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The scraping continued, a soft, rhythmic sound, like a tiny, persistent hand at work. He peered through the crack in the door. The nursery was bathed in the soft morning light, the yellow walls seeming to glow with a false cheerfulness. His son was still in his crib, now awake and watching the ceiling with an unnerving stillness. And then Jonathan saw it. From the ventilation grill directly above his son's crib, a small section of the metal was moving. It wasn't rattling or loose. It was being meticulously, carefully unscrewed. Jonathan could see the faint glint of metal on metal, the slow rotation of the screws. Someone, or something, was unscrewing the ventilation grill from the inside. The entity hadn't wasted any time. Its offer, its terrifying demand, was now being followed by a tangible, horrifying action. It was opening a door. A door that led directly to his son. Jonathan stood frozen, caught between the primal urge to protect and the paralyzing fear of what lay beyond that slowly widening aperture. The whispers had now intensified, not in volume, but in their insistent, demanding tone. They were no longer just recounting his past. They were orchestrating his future. He could hear the distinct click as the last screw loosened, the faint groan of metal against metal as the grill began to pivot inwards. A sliver of darkness appeared, a gaping maw within the ceiling. And then, a shadow detached itself from the deeper blackness of the ventilation shaft. It was not a human shadow, not entirely. It was too fluid, too elongated, its form shifting with an unnatural grace. It was a presence that radiated a cold, ancient malice, a hunger that had waited for centuries. Jonathan's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to scream, to run, to snatch his son from the crib, but his limbs were locked in place, his muscles rigid with a terror that went beyond anything he had ever imagined. The shadow extended, reaching downwards, its tendrils unfurling like dark ribbons. It was moving towards his son, who remained strangely placid, his wide, innocent eyes fixed on the descending darkness. The whispers, now a cacophony in Jonathan's mind, echoed the entity's triumph: a new beginning, Leo. A new vessel. And Sarah's secret remains safe. You are free. But Jonathan knew, with a soul-shattering certainty, that he was anything but free. He was bound, not by the law, not by his past, but by a bargain struck in the deepest, darkest corners of his fear. He was a prisoner in his own home, orchestrating, or perhaps a silent witness to, the ultimate betrayal. The shadow continued its descent, its form now more defined, yet still too abstract to comprehend. Jonathan could only watch, a silent spectator to the unfolding horror, the faint cries of his son, now tinged with a new, unnatural fear, swallowed by the insatiable hunger that had finally found its way out of the walls. The social workers had been wrong. This apartment was not a wonderful place for his child. It was a trap. And the door, the one he had so desperately sought for his son, had just been opened by a darkness he could never have conceived. The ventilation grill hung open, a silent, gaping maw, and the shadow continued its inexorable approach, leaving Jonathan with nothing but the chilling echo of a choice made in desperation and the horrifying realization that some secrets are best left buried, even at the highest cost.
The moral of this story is whispered. The only truly unbreakable bond is the one between a person and their darkest secret. We can run from justice, but not from home itself, which is a bargaining chip. Sometimes, to save ourselves, we must commit the greatest betrayal. To remain free by making a deal with the darkness is to become an eternal prisoner of our own choice.